Yes. Justice at the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers, past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however infinitesimal, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. As of now, it's not all that cold, but we do have a lot of blankets. Well, I'm not that cold, maybe you are already. But we have a lot of blankets right at the entrance to the Sukkah. So if you get cold at any time, feel free to take a blanket. Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see you all here. Welcome to the second event of the USF SWIG program for Studies in Social Justice for the fall semester. For those of you I don't know, my name is Oren Kroll-Zeldin, and I am the Assistant Director of the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. I want to begin by thanking the SWIG JSSJ faculty and staff for their hard work in making tonight's in this very beautiful Sukkah, which I'll talk about in a moment, possible. I want to take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about the SWIG program. Founded in 1977, our program at a Catholic university anywhere in the world. In 2008, we were reestablished as the program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, academic program worldwide to formally link Jewish studies and social justice. Including a minor in this field in the classroom, the program offers a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses not found in any other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer extraordinary events, much like the one we will have tonight, that are all free and open to the public. Let me tell you very briefly about some of the other events we're going to have this semester. Mostly, we have a full slate of events this week that will be taking place mostly right here in this Sukkah. So tomorrow night, there will be a Shabbat dinner here at 5:30 with Or Shalom Synagogue. On Monday evening, 5:30, there's an event called Nourishing Our Collective Power, which is in collaboration with the Leo McCarthy Center for Public Service and the Common Good, and with USF Votes. On Tuesday at noon, you can join us for lunch here in the Sukkah, which will be featuring food made with love by the students in the Community Garden Outreach. This food starts at noon and will last until it's food. So don't show up too late if you want to be here. On Tuesday, next Tuesday, later on in the afternoon at 4:30, we're actually hosting a Zoom webinar, so not something here in the Sukkah. That is called Body, Soul, Gender, and God, Trans and Non-Binary Identities and the Art of Being Human, with poet, scholar, and activist Joy Layden. I know that's a whole lot of stuff. I didn't give you much information. There's flyers right outside that has a QR code with all the information. Lots more than what I provided for you. So if you're interested in coming to any of those things, we would love to see you. And then our final event for the semester takes place on Monday, November 11th at 6:30 p.m. in Fromm Hall. That event is called American Jews and the Movement for Justice in Palestine, and I feel weird saying this, but it features me speaking about my new book that just came out quite recently with the same title. Through the SWIG JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic. Whether one has time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours or an hour and a half to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the light on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or another social identity altogether. We are gathered here in this beautiful Sukkah on the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, which is an ancient autumn harvest festival. While much of the rituals surrounding the holiday focus on rejoicing and thanking God for the successful harvest, the Sukkah itself, this temporary hut, represents the very huts that farmers would live in during the final days of harvest before the coming of the winter rains. Being here in the Sukkah tonight is an appropriate location for this talk. Our speaker, Elia-Shalev, will discuss the Israeli Black Panthers, who, among other things, pushed issues of housing discrimination into the national conversation in Israel in the early 1970s. As we sit here tonight in the Sukkah on this holiday, the Jewish tradition calls on us to remember that everyone deserves a right to a home. The Israeli Black Panthers, who we'll learn more about shortly, did an excellent job reminding us of that. And as the winter rains are on the horizon, we must also remember those in Gaza, in Lebanon, and elsewhere whose homes and lives have been destroyed by the various Israeli establishment that the Panthers confronted over a half-century ago. While Sukkot is known as Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing, it is also our responsibility as we celebrate during this holiday to expose ourselves to the vulnerability in the world, both on our local streets and in our global community. Now let me introduce our illustrious speaker. Asaf Elia-Shalev is a journalist and writer, currently serving as a senior reporter with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which distributes his work to dozens of media outlets in multiple languages. He's the author of the phenomenal new book, Israel's Black Panthers, The Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth, which was published earlier this year by UC Press. Buy this book. Don't just buy this book. Read this book. It is a phenomenally told story about a very, very important social movement. The story of an activist movement that challenged the racial inequities of Israel that continue to reverberate today. So please join me in welcoming Asaf to the University of San Francisco.
Hi, Oren. That introduction, very generous of you. Much to be excited about with this talk for me. Welcome to the Sukkah, Chag Sameach, Happy Sukkot. I'm getting to talk to college students, which is one of my favorite things, and to someone who actually was a first-hand witness to the events I described in the book. That's Nurit right there. And Olin is someone I knew from the very time where spark that would go on to create this book happened. So I know Olin from when I was a college student across the bay in Berkeley. Much like you, judging by the fact you came to an event sponsored by a program that has social justice in its name, right? Much like you, I cared a lot about social justice at the time. And still, and I was very, very much into activism on campus, and I wrote all my papers about the Black Panther movement. How many of you know about the original American Black Panther movement? Can you raise your hand for a second? Okay, so not everyone, but a lot of you. That's good. Okay, and while I was protesting and organizing and studying, I came across a reference on the internet to the Israeli Black Panthers, and it said that they represented the struggle of Jews of Middle Eastern descent, Mizrahi Jews, in Israel in 1971, in fighting against racism, and that was really significant to me because my family, my own family, is from Iraq, is from Baghdad, and I was like, wait a second, what does this history have to do with me? I grew up as a white kid in the United States, but there's more to my story than just that. So I went off and investigated, and I was pretty frustrated because the internet had almost no information about the legacy of the Panthers at all. This is the internet of 15 years ago, right? So today you could find 1 million articles. But I started to explore. I was really hoping my own father, grandfather had some kind of involvement, and to my dismay, they did not. They were total normies. But I did end up through this process reading everything I can and actually meeting one of the founders of the Israeli Black Panthers, Ovena Bergel. And what I realized, no one had told their story, and then not only the story of the Panthers, the story of Mizrahi Jews was, I felt very strongly, missing from the narratives that were being told about Israel and Palestine. Everyone talked about that place as a dichotomy, Arab and Jew, Palestinian and Israeli. And the reality, I realized, was more complicated than that. In any kind of there's more nuance. There's actually a whole hierarchy with Mizrahim in the middle. Those are people who came from Arab countries, had Arab customs, spoke Arabic, and they came to Israel, and they were Jews, but they were mistreated in similar but different ways as Palestinians. And I had this idea in my early 20s that I would help fix that problem in the discourse and tell the world the Mizrahi story. And meanwhile, I was kind of graduating out of being an activist and decided to become a journalist. And I was falling in love with a type of writing known as narrative nonfiction, or kind of magazine writing tends to be like that. Creative nonfiction, there's a lot of names for that. And I wanted to write a book about the Panthers. I decided I was going to be the person who's going to fill that gap, tell the story that hadn't been told. I met a Panther, one of the founders, and we sat down for a series of interviews, maybe 50 hours of recorded interviews. And I didn't really know what was going to happen with that. I had the early conceptions of a book, and then I kind of realized, and I actually went to study journalism in grad school, and I realized that in order to tell this book, I need to do a lot more than interview this one person. It's a great basis for a book, but it's nowhere near enough. And so I went to every archive I could find that might have materials on this topic, and spent years in Israel interviewing every last Black Panther I could, and allies and different figures were involved, including the Minister of Police of Israel at the time. And even the police kind of detective who was in charge of suppressing the movement. Talked to him a couple years before he died and learned some interesting things. And I read thousands of news articles from the time period about the Panthers. And in this book, I stitched together all this information in a narrative way. So it's a book that has a plot and characters and dialogues and scene. And the idea is to create an immersive experience for the reader. And I'm glad Oren is someone who felt compelled by their story, and I hope I get to share a little bit of it with you today. Let's see. Let's go back now 120 years, 130 years to the early days of the Zionist movement in Europe, right? So the Jews of Europe, known as Ashkenazi Jews, had a major problem on their hand. There were pogroms, there was terrible anti-Semitism, murderous anti-Semitism, and there were all these, there's all these discussions and all these ideas flowing about what to do about the anti-Semitism that people are facing. And one of the leading ideas that emerged at the time was Zionism, right? The idea of creating a state in Palestine for the Jews, and very explicitly at the time they talked about it being a European state in Palestine. It was going to be modeled after nationalism that was kind of gaining popularity in Europe at the time. But the Zionist movement had a major problem, and that is that the Jews of Europe didn't really want to go to Palestine and participate in the settlement and the colonization of the land. More than 1 million Jews left Europe in those years, but they went to North America. That's why we have a big, robust Jewish American community today. That's why we have a Jewish program here at USF. Fast forward to the Holocaust, where the Nazis exterminated 6 million Jews of Europe. And then after the Holocaust, after World War II, there were still some Jews left in Europe, but they became locked behind the Iron Curtain that the Soviet Union put up, and they weren't allowed to leave. So the Israel is founded in 1948, and there are very few Jews in the land. And that's really when the Zionist movement decides to tap this other reservoir of Jews that exist, the million or so Jews that were spread out throughout the Middle East. Morocco, Yemen, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, all of these countries. There were Jewish communities there from ancient times. And at that point, it kind of became untenable to be a Jew living in many of these countries. It used to be that people were Arabs and Jews at the same time. That wasn't much of an issue for a while. And then that binary was kind of enforced through the rise of Arab nationalism and the rise of Zionism, which forced people to pick an identity. And sometimes they didn't really have a choice in the matter. And that's when there was a mass exodus of Jews from the Middle East, and they came to Israel. The thing is, when they were set to arrive, the leadership of this new state wanted them, but was also very, very scared of these people. They had just spent the independence war fighting against Arab enemies. 1 million Palestinians were kicked out or fled, and here they were going to bring in 1 million more people who in many ways resembled the Palestinians who were gone, right? They had similar features, similar culture, similar language, similar family structures, and there was this nervousness about it, and there was a lot of really, really strong racism towards this population that really hadn't yet arrived in large numbers. So the founder of Israel, the first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, he talked about them as about the Mizrahim who were arriving as dirty, as unmannered, as prone to rape, prone to murder, prone to theft, right? And there are other leaders calling them, saying that the Jewish spirit had all but left them from all those generations spent among the Muslims and among the Arabs, and that somehow, because according to this racist mindset, the Arabs had a lower cognitive ability, the Jews had been lowered by being in proximity to them. This is really the theory that was kind of animating Israeli leaders in those days. The average Ashkenazi or European Jew had a certain term that they would, and a racial epithet. It was Shvarze Chaya, which means, in Yiddish, means black animal. Many people I interviewed for this book had these painful memories of being children being referred to as Shvarze Chaya by someone who's supposed to be a fellow Jew. Now, I'm going to fast forward for a second. Black Panther, Shvarze Chaya is a black animal, right? So by choosing that name, there was a certain reclamation of that term by the Panthers. So if you have this whole discourse about a group of people who's arriving and they're very dangerous and they're dirty, well, you're pretty well doing something about that, right? So now we have policies that are enacted at every level of government to marginalize and exclude Mizrahi Jews. They get the poor jobs, they get poor housing, they are settled in many cases on the periphery of the country, in these little tent encampments in the middle of the desert, or in places where they're exposed to foreign militants coming in and attacking them. So you kind of get this situation. There's a whole second-class citizenship created for Jews. The Mizrahim who are arriving, some of them, there's families mostly from Morocco, who are very pious. They come to Israel in 1950, and when people try to settle them, the government tries to settle them in the periphery or in the middle of nowhere, they say, no, we've been praying towards Jerusalem since time immemorial. We're going to go to Jerusalem. So they go without being really allowed to, and there isn't housing for them, so where do they end up living? Well, Jerusalem was split into two cities at the time. There was East Jerusalem, where Palestinians lived, and West Jerusalem, where Jews lived. And in the middle, there was a militarized no man's land with snipers and barbed wire and all kinds of barricades and all these bombed out houses that Palestinians had ran away from. This land didn't belong to Jordan or to Israel. It was a no man's land. And these families came and poured into these homes and kind of established an Israeli presence in them. And they lived under the constant threat of war. Sometimes there was exchange of fire right above their head, and sometimes people even were hit by the bullets. And because this didn't officially belong to Israel, there also weren't government services. Maybe police would come in to arrest you, but for many years there, it took a while before there was a school. There was sewage running through the street. There was crowdedness like you couldn't imagine. I mean, I read a story about 120 people in one building sharing one bathroom. Families had 10 kids or more in many of the families. This was very common at the time. So these were kind of the conditions where the group of people who would become the Panthers grew up. They're outside really of what's considered normal Israel. There's a threat of war. There's the utter poverty of what they're experiencing, and they grew up. They either arrived in Israel as babies or were born there in the early 50s, and things kind of go this way. That some of them go off to juvenile institutions and come back in trouble with the law. There are thousands of young Mizrahi men who are kind of outside of the home, hanging out in the street, organized into street gangs. That's what they called them at the time. Up to no good, no job, not serving in the military rate, which is mandatory in Israel. But wouldn't take you at the time if you were one of these Mizrahi street thug, considered a Mizrahi street thug. And then one day, or rather in 6 days, everything changes. 1967, there's a war, and to the surprise of absolutely everyone, Israel very, very easily and very quickly defeats the foreign armies that are around its borders and expands its land by a lot, including Jerusalem, right? So Jerusalem is no longer divided into east and west. The walls and barricades separating them come down, and that is as big a deal for that region as the fall of the Berlin Wall was, right? We learn about the fall of the Berlin Wall as a major milestone. Well, this was kind of and all of a sudden what was a backwaters of Jerusalem, which itself was a backwaters of Israel at the time, and that no one wanted to go there, was like a war-torn, forgotten place, all of a sudden became the most interesting place in the world, right? Everyone wanted to go see the holy sites. Israelis from the rest of the country wanted to go to see the holy sites that they couldn't see before because they were on the Jordanian side. The rest of the hippies were coming in for the first time. Rock and roll was arriving. This was 1967. All of these things that had been raging for years in Europe and the United States were arriving with this delay. Drugs, rock and roll, liberal attitudes about sexuality. And these young men who were kind of the Mizrahi street thugs, and particularly the ones who grew up in this neighborhood, in the no man's land, neighborhood's called Musrara, by the way, they were perfectly positioned to take full advantage of everything that was coming in. Drugs, yes, give it to us. Rock and roll, we love it. Forget the old stuff. They weren't interested in the religion of their parents. They weren't interested in all that stuff. They wanted to belong. They wore their hair long like the hippies. They tried to make their clothes match. They wanted to be like the young people of the rest of the world who were rebelling and fighting the man and getting high, and that's what they want to do. And they were finally, really for the first time in their lives, having sex, because all these foreigners were coming, and they were like the sexy thing at the time, and so there was this like whole exchange. So they were having the time of their lives. And part of this kind of exchange that was happening between these young men and the rest of the world involved learning about these revolutionary groups. They learned about groups in Europe, in France, the student movement in France, the Radicals in Germany, the Tupamaros in Uruguay, and of course the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican Young Lords, and of course the Black Panthers that started across the bay in Oakland. And that's the group that they said they wanted to be just like them. They found them really inspiring. They found their symbols really powerful. They also knew that it would cause a massive stir if they started to copy or take up the name of the Panthers, because the Black Panthers in Israel at the time were, there was a lot of coverage of them in the newspaper. They supported the Palestinian cause, and so the Israeli press was full of articles of calling them anti-Semitic. And not only that, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, her name was Golda Meir. She was raised in the United States, so she was more aware than the average Israeli of the racial dynamics back in the United States. So she's particularly sensitive to anything that talks about racism. So they, through the influence, don't have to get into all that, but through the influence of these different radicals from Israel and from abroad, and the literature that was coming in, they decided they're going to organize into a movement. They realized that their own lives of not having school, not having a job, living in poverty, no prospect, that's not just them having that struggle. It's actually something that's been affecting their whole community, and there's reasons for it, and they wanted to start to figure out why and to change it. And they decide they're going to have a protest, their very first protest. The police has already, by this point, infiltrated the group and is spying on the group. And the police freak out. They're like, we can't have this. They don't really know what to do. I mean, it's just a bunch of young people who want to protest. Well, what do we do about it? So they took it to their commander, took it to the chief of police of Israel. He took it to the minister of police of Israel, and the minister of police took it to the prime minister of Israel, who calls an emergency meeting. These young people want to have a protest. They haven't done anything illegal. Who are they? No one really knows. A second ago, they were just considered street thugs, right? And now the prime minister's having an emergency meeting to decide what to do about this plan to have a protest. And she authorizes something that was unprecedented in Israeli history. She approves a plan to preemptively arrest this group of young people who want to have a protest and are calling themselves the Black Panthers. This is like the thought police. They haven't even committed a crime yet. And today we kind of call this administrative detention. It's a practice in Israel that was used before that time on Palestinians and is still used against Palestinians today. But that was the first time I've been able to find that was applied to Jews, where you're arrested without really having committed a crime or being suspected of committing a crime. And so they go and the police go and raid all the little cafes where people were hanging out in their homes and everywhere. And they, if you're leaving because you're cold, you can have my jacket, by the way, because I saw that you're wearing nothing. Okay. And they arrest these young people, and that's kind of this shocking thing that teaches them that they're really onto something. Right, why do they care so much that they're are arresting us because we said we'd have a protest? And also, anyone in Israel who maybe didn't care, wasn't paying attention, but has a conscience and can tell the difference between right and wrong is let those kids go. What are you doing? And then a protest happens anyway, of course, and they force the government to release them. And that's what really launches the movement. Now, I mentioned a few times that the core group that started the Panthers were men, and I want to address the gender question right now before I forget. So the way society was structured at the time in the Mizrahi community was that the young women were still at that point more likely to remain tethered to the parents and to the traditional roles expected of them. The boys were getting in trouble, getting out of the house and in the streets, and they hung out together. It was a separate, right, the young people hung out completely separately from each other. And the first kernel of the Black Panthers happened in this particular group of young men. But after the movement was launched, by the very first protest, the family members at first, and then the friends, and then others, women became very, very involved in the movement, and yet there isn't much or enough documentation of that history. So that's something I struggled with during the research. But I definitely wanted to explain like why things happened the way they did. So the Panthers surfaced all these problems that Israel did not want to acknowledge. Right? This is a country that is supposed to be set up as a haven for the Jews of the world, and yet some Jews are privileged over others, and that really is the subtitle of my book. Right? Israel's Black Panthers: The Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth. They punctured that myth of egalitarianism and socialism and equality for Jews. I mean, I think it's very clear from the very beginning that Palestinians had less rights in this place. That was no, but also the majority of Jews, right? Because Mizrahim were the majority, had a lower status and had something to do with their Arabness, right? The reason they were was because they share the Arabness with the Palestinians. That really kind of complicates our understanding of Israel. And I don't think you can understand anything about Israeli politics today or about challenging anything that's happening in Israel today without actually understanding the power dynamics of that country. And I'm skipping ahead. We'll explain how this all plays out today. But the Panthers held these protests where they fought against police. They were in the news all the time. They put out newspapers. They did neighborhood cleanup campaigns. They did summer camps. They did some tutoring for kids. Never did they get to the level of organization and discipline and impact of impact is probably equal, but the Black Panthers was by far a more impressive organization, right? They were nationwide, very organized. They had schools, they had the free breakfast programs, they did a million things. They also had weapons, right, in the American group. In Israel, they talked a big game about being radical. They used terms like by any means necessary. They threatened to overthrow the state, but they weren't like the American Panthers. The American Panthers saw themselves as a vanguard, a Marxist, anti-imperialist vanguard that was going to overthrow the establishment, join with all the revolutionary movements around the world, get rid of capitalism, get rid of imperialism. And the Israelis ultimately wanted the promise of Israel to be fulfilled. They wanted to belong. They wanted to be treated as equals. And they had an enormous impact, right? So they not only surfaced all these topics, housing, education, all the inequality, the poverty that was happening, they also actually caused the government to finally change its policies. Budgets were passed across every level of government to support social services. The way policing and criminal justice system were completely changed. I mean, it used to be that if you were a 9-year-old who stole a thing from the market because you were hungry, you were kind of put through the same system as an adult, and that was changed. The army, which is this very important vehicle for social mobility in Israel, stopped excluding people who stole a piece of fruit at the market when they were 9 years old because of the Panthers. Now, is it good or bad that Mizrahim ended up advancing and being very influential in the Israeli army? There's a lot of opinions on that topic, but that was an impact of them. More profoundly, I would argue, was massive cultural renaissance that they unleashed, where Mizrahim were all of a sudden coming out of the woodwork to share their art, to share their music, to be heard. And today, Israel is a very proudly multicultural country. Israel always puts on display its racial and ethnic diversity. That used to not be the case. It used to present whiteness to the world and Europeanness to the world. Again, you could say that they're doing it for cynical reasons or whatever, but it is proud of like its multiculturalism, and Israel is really racially and ethnically diverse, which again just complicates. Again, doesn't any particular position, but it does complicate the picture and requires us to grapple with if we really want to take a stance on what's happening over there. Ironically, the Black Panthers ended up leading or helping lead to the rise of right-wing politics in Israel. So the founders of Israel styled themselves socialists, right? There were the kibbutzim, were these collectives, real like hardcore communist collectives that kind of were the founding force of the country. And then the Labor Party, which was the ruling party of Israel for 20 years, were socialist. The Panthers were resisting them because calling them out on their bullshit, right? You claim to be socialist, but yet what is this? What's going on? Why do things look the way they look? And once the Mizrahi public empowered to rebel against the establishment, well, they ended up going to the right. There was a charismatic leader named as Menachem Begin. He founded the party that Israel's current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the head of now, right? So Netanyahu's predecessor, Begin, he told the Mizrahi public, I see you, I hear you. Everything that the establishment's been saying about you is wrong. You belong center stage. You be our partners. You're the real warriors. You're the real Jews. You're the real substance of this country. And he offered them a path towards inclusion. Like, remember, I said the Panthers said they're radical, but they really wanted to belong. And I think that's true about the Mizrahi immigrants who arrived in Israel. They came on this promise of, let's build a state together. And they were like just dumbfounded and angry and confused that they would come and the Jews that were supposed to give them a hand and be partners with them were like mistreat them in that way. There's a whole generation of Mizrahim that lost their pride over that reality. And here was a right-wing leader who said, no, let's overcome all of that. I will offer you a path into the center, and I'm going to be extra nationalistic. And Mizrahim, remember, a lot of them, I happen to not look that Arab, although there's a whole story with that, but a lot of Mizrahim do look very Arab, right? And that actually can be a problem in Israel. Like, if you look Arab and you have a big black backpack on, you get stopped by police, you get beat up by police, you could get shot by police. Like, that's happened before. Not that it's okay that Palestinian Arabs get mistreated by police, but Mizrahim are like, that shouldn't happen to us. We're Jews. So how do you overcome that? How do you overcome the fact that Arabness is the enemy? For a lot of people, the way you overcome it is this kind of self-hate. I'm going to hate Arabs. I'm going to be nationalistic. I'm going to be more and more hawkish and more right-wing. Also remember that Mizrahim were on the periphery of the country. So they were the first ones that suffered if there was war. When Palestinian militants invaded, they were the ones who were attacked. If you remember, if you've learned about the Second Intifada, that was a period when Israel had bus bombings every week. Who takes the bus? Everyone does, but a higher Mizrahim were overrepresented on these buses, and so they're getting blown up in these attacks. And so their reaction to all of this has been to create an alliance with the right wing, with the Likud party in Israel, and so that's why I said the Panthers had this like ironic impact that a left-wing group ended up empowering the rise of right-wing politics in Israel. And over time, there has been change. I mentioned the government policies that were enacted in the immediate wake of the Panthers. And today we see there is a very, very large Mizrahi middle class. There's a lot of very wealthy Mizrahi people. They are, if anything, overrepresented in music and in the media. Right there. And yet there are still issues, right? No prime minister of Israel is ever Mizrahi. All the top government positions, the top ministries, defense, finance, foreign ministry, all those almost always still go to Ashkenazi Jews. The Supreme Court, there's been very few Mizrahim on the Supreme Court of Israel. In academia, it showed that 92% of academia is Ashkenazi in a country where they only make up like 30% of the population. And Israelis will they'll be very quick to tell you the problem has disappeared, it's a thing of the past. And I've been in many of those conversations where 2 minutes later they say something and they don't make a connection between like how salient this issue is still. And I think kind of the most one example that I think of, just last year there was an official with the Likud party who's Mizrahi, and who apparently he holds this grievance about the past, and he said about the Nazis and about Ashkenazi Jews, the Nazis should have killed you all, the rest of you, none of you should have survived. A terrible thing to say, right? And no way on earth to justify that. It does reflect that this is a live issue in Israel today. Every time there's an election, there's an Ashkenazi cultural icon or figure or politician who talks about Mizrahim in a very derogatory and demeaning way and condescending way, and that dominates the news cycle because these issues are still raw today. And yet, Mizrahim have by now become total partners in the Zionist project and in the Israeli power structure. And that brings us really to how do we look at the events of last October 7th when Hamas attacked and killed a bunch of people and kidnapped a bunch of people. How did that scramble? Because it scrambled everything. It scrambled my brain, certainly. It scrambled the politics. We're going to keep feeling the impact of that for many, many years to come. So let's go back now to the time of the Panthers, to 1973. 2 years after the Panthers were founded, Israel had its first October 7th, its original existential panic, its original big trauma. There was a war in 1973 in which it seemed to people that Israel was going to lose and was going to get wiped off the map. After that war, the Panthers that's when their movement stopped being able to command public attention because no one wanted to talk about these issues of poverty anymore. People were scared from war, and there was an emphasis on unity. And any talk about this type of Jew and that type of Jew, no, that was suppressed, right? And then we got the paradigm shift with the rise of the right, the rise of the Likud, 4 years later in 1977. So we had this traumatic event lead to a paradigm shift in Israel. I think that October 7th is going to lead to another paradigm shift. Right before this happened, there were 2 years of protests against the government of Netanyahu. There were calls for him to resign to no avail. After October 7th, all the protest groups stopped protesting. Everyone was focused on unity. Everyone was focused on responding to Hamas, on the war against Hamas in Gaza. And it's going to take some time, just like it took back then. It's going to take some time for whatever's next to happen. And I don't think it's going to be a return to left-wing politics in Israel. But we're going to see a fundamental change. We will see if the alliance between the Likud and the Mizrahi public can hold, right? And I don't really have a guess for that, but I think that the ultimate takeaway I have from learning the story of the Panthers and writing this book, and what I want you to go home with, was that the Panthers were this group of young people who came from nothing, didn't have any education, right? They dropped out of school in like third grade, right? That was like the average age people finished. And they were not supposed to amount to anything in life. And yet, they were brilliant and daring and had this spark to them, this brilliance. And they changed the course of Israeli history, right? They empowered a whole generation of people. They led to the creation of a whole genres of creativity in theater, literature, dance, fine arts, anything you can think of. They had a huge impact on me. A few generations removed, thousands of miles removed, when I went back and learned about my family history and about our own immigration to Israel and what that experience was like. Because I grew up partially in Israel, and my family was all from there. And I just want, I'm no longer of that young, right, like a lot of you are. So you're either, I want all of you to always be prepared for the next group of young people who may come from somewhere very unexpected, where people didn't think they were going to amount to anything, and yet they're going to change the world inevitably. The next group's coming, and I think that our job, if you're a young person, is maybe to join them or to be them. And my job and others here is to support them and to not be cynical and to not dismiss them and to not fall into stereotypes. Oh, they're just street thugs. They won't do it. Wait, let's listen. Let's pay attention, because even when things feel very hopeless, and things in Israel and Palestine feel very, very hopeless right now, history moves in these like unexpected ways, and if it didn't, that would just be very depressing. So I want you to, that's a takeaway. Be prepared for the next ones that are going to revolutionize. And Owen, how are we on time? Should we do questions? Yeah, we should do questions.
So
Oh.
can you just repeat the question after it's asked so that everyone can hear?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, I heard you mention a lot, like a motivating feeling being like the sense of belonging, and so I guess I was kind of curious about what supporting the Palestinian cause looked like for this group, and if you believe that you can actually challenge an ethnic hierarchy while also maintaining an ethno-state.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I realized I didn't talk about their relationship with the Palestinians at all, and that's actually really important. So the question is, well, I understood the question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to repeat it. I know exactly what I want to say. Can you maybe say it out loud or say it again so I can repeat it to everyone?
So I guess it was kind of two. The first one is like what actually supporting the Palestinian cause looked like for this group.
Okay.
And then if you believe that you can actually challenge an
Ethno-state.
while also maintaining an ethno-state.
Okay. What did supporting the Palestinians look like for this group, and can you challenge an ethnic hierarchy while also maintaining an ethno-state? Did I get that right? Good. So the Panthers grew up in this neighborhood right near the no man's land, right, where there were barricades. Across these barbed wire fences were Palestinians. So they had their whole childhood looking across, and there were kids that they got to know through their faces, or maybe a kite that was flown over, and there was this mutual curiosity that was created. And once in 1967, the war that unified Jerusalem, the walls came down. Where did the Panthers, or the kids who would be the Panthers, where did they go? Did they go to like the rich Jews on the other side of town, the Ashkenazi Jews, or did they go? They found a lot more natural affinity with the Palestinians that lived so close to them, that were forbidden, right, because of the barbed wire. And there was real kind of coexistence, real relationships, businesses, families, everything started together for a period of time. And so right off the bat, they had a very unique kind of interaction and relationship with Palestinians they found that they can communicate very easily, even though they spoke different dialects of Arabic, close enough to create connections. They found just so much familiarity. They also like smoked a lot of hash together, right? Because there was like a whole hashish trade going on at the time. So that was a huge like social lubricant that can't be overemphasized enough. And they became the Panthers, and they got started. They were ahead of almost anyone in Israeli society when it came to the Palestinian issue. So we talked about Palestinian at the time in Israel. They were the enemy. They were terrorists. Israelis refused to use the word Palestinian, refused to acknowledge they exist, and the Panthers endorsed a two-state solution, which doesn't sound very radical today, like a state where Israel gets to stay a Jewish state and Palestinians get their own, but like no one in Israel was anywhere near saying that, and they were the very first Israelis to meet with Yasser Arafat, the father and founder of the Palestinian national movement, right? He was considered an outlaw terrorist. They met with him, and then the government passed a law making it illegal for Israelis to meet with him. No one ever thought anyone would do that, so that they had to pass a law only after they did it. And so they protested against the settlements in the West Bank back in the 1970s. They, both on the kind of moral and ethical grounds, but also because the government, instead of sending money to relieve poverty, they were subsidizing settlements in the West Bank on Palestinian land. They're like, so it was very, very important for them to protest against that. So, and kind of the Panther that I interviewed the most, who I met and introduced me to this story, ended up becoming, as anti-Zionist as you can get, as you can possibly get. And he has been involved shoulder to shoulder with Palestinian liberation movements for decades. Other Panthers didn't end up in that place, so there's not a way to generalize. Now, can you challenge ethnic hierarchy while maintaining ethno-state? I don't know. But you have to know about the hierarchy, at least, right? Even for strategic reasons. It's not helpful to paint every Israeli with the exact same brushstroke, and I don't really answer. I don't really know. I'm curious what you think. Yeah, I mean, my interpretation of the question is, if Israel's an ethno-state, and that's using a term I don't know if everyone agrees with or understands, how if you're not challenging the very basis of the Israeli state, if you're not challenging the kind of the Jewish superiority that's built into it, what does all this challenging the ethnic hierarchy even mean? Does it matter? Does it have value? I would argue that if there is that the most radical and the most transformative movement on the Israeli side of things has been the Panthers, and you could say I don't have any, Palestinians should just resist, should not find partners on the Israeli side. I don't know. That's what some people say. Okay, but if you're looking for partners, I think you should look in some places that may be unexpected, or you should at least understand Israeli society. And 15 years ago, when I was a college student and I went to Israel, and that was a time of enormous optimism in Israel. I witnessed real movements, real radical movements, where they called it co-resistance, right? Where Palestinians and Israelis were resisting the occupation together. There were protests every Sunday all over the West to challenge of the occupation, where you had people from lots of Israelis, lots of Palestinians. There was a lot of cultural creation together. A lot of that has gone away, and there's just a lot of rage, from what I can tell, a lot of hopelessness. But in that time period, it seemed like anything was possible. And I think, we'll see how things shake out. Sorry, I don't have like a definitive answer.
Can I just ask that it's an interesting chart of the ethno state. It sounds like the underlying equities is a different state. So maybe you should explain which means how that would differ from, say, Syria.
I'll separate that. We're not going to have a debate about the ethno state term. Absolutely, I absolutely veto that. Because that would just take over. The purposes of this talk is to talk about the Panthers, and to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the prism of Mizrahim, sure. But I'm not going to debate Middle Eastern politics with people today. I saw your hand next.
What I know about the Mizrahi, the Jew came from the Arab world. The Israel at the time, after they established in 1948, they need somebody to do the hard labor.
Sure, yeah.
This was the point why they brought to Israel.
Yeah, I don't think I emphasized that enough. So, do you have a question? Or do you? I can share that with the group.
I just want to say because you didn't mention that.
Yeah, you're right. I usually do, and I forgot. But
They brought them there to do the hard labor, the job nobody wanted to do.
all right, let me tell him in 10 seconds. I'll explain, and then do you have a question, or that's it? So just he wanted me to emphasize something I definitely did miss, is that part of the reason the state brought the Mizrahim is that they needed the numbers to establish a state, and also like hard labor and just people to serve. They needed the bodies, and they needed menial labor. So they keep emphasizing that point.
And he take any military,
Right,
they
and
didn't give a
right.
bench, he didn't give a chance to
Exactly.
take the military, they kept it very,
Yep.
very, very
Thank you.
low.
Any other questions? I saw your hand.
Yeah, I have Mizrahi friends who are like reinvestigating their Arab identity and learning Arabic, and I'm wondering, and they often identify as anti-Zionist, and I wonder if you see that segment of Mizrahi Jews in Israel kind of emerging, and if you see any possibility for that being a form of
Well, we probably know some of the same people. So, listen, I could be surprised, but I think that idea is mostly dead right now. 15 years ago, there were poetry slams all over the place. There was a whole scene. And those people didn't go away or change, but like, it's nowhere near what it used to be. But yeah. Oh, and I didn't explain the question. Sorry. You were saying that. Oh my God. I've not done this part of events. Usually, someone else does this part. But you said you know a lot of Mizrahim who are anti-Zionists, who are investigating the roots, connecting to the Arabness, learning Arabic, playing the music of their grandparents, and all this stuff. And like, I have a ton of friends like that, and those people used to kind of be organized into like a community that like did stuff together, and like that's not as much, doesn't exist as much anymore, but it's like theoretically a very powerful thing to do, to like this state that's premised on like being apart from Arabs, and we have all these Israelis who are like, no, we want the Arabness, like how do we do it? I think that's fascinating and like very creative and very radical, but I don't think that movement is strong right now.
Can you go up to the microphone if you're going to ask the question?
I'll do a better job, but
Got it?
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Got it? Okay.
I'm just really focused on your questions and I forget to like, but now I will do it.
I have a question. I haven't read your book, and I've seen it at like a local bookstore.
Well, that's cool.
It's really cool. But I just had a question about Robin, and like I think he was assassinated,
Uh-huh.
and I'm just wondering how, because at least in the American understanding, he's the first one to sort of really get close to peace.
Uh-huh.
Right, and I just wonder how his assassination sort of, I don't know, maybe disrupted, or how that led into the whole, I don't know, does that make any sense?
So he's asking about the deceased Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated in the 90s after signing the Oslo Accords with Yasser Arafat, which led to a lot of things. I don't want to, it's really not actually that relevant to the topic, and so I could tell you the whole history of Rabin and his life and the Oslo Accords and all that, but maybe that's a side conversation. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I'm not feeling that between the Mizrahim and the Ashkenazi people. I'm not feeling that this is the reality right now as it was with the Black Panthers. And I have a question for you. You talked about that 15 years ago was a lot of protests about stop the occupation between Palestinians and Israelis together. Right now, things change. And we all know that right now there is a real Palestinian government that can take control to rule the country. And correct me if I'm wrong, but right now, if the terror organization continue to control Palestinians, we cannot build a side-by-side countries right now. What do you say about that?
Okay, so you introduce yourself. This part matters. Says the 22 Israeli recently released from the Israeli military, and you're Mizrahi, and you felt these issues are something of the past and not something that's been alive in your life, and that was a segue to say that you said 15 years ago maybe there was a chance for peace with the Palestinians, but right now. Looks like they're controlled by terrorists, and how do you make peace with terrorists or something like that? First of all, Hamas is not in charge in the West Bank, so if that's what you mean, they're not in charge. They're not in charge in the West Bank, where the majority of Palestinians within Israeli control live. That is again beyond the purview of this talk. Like I have opinions, but like I don't really care about opinions that much. And I don't think they have that much value. Like my opinion, there's another hot take. Like I don't want to argue about stuff. I'd like to share stories and tell history and lead to conversations. So I apologize again. Like I'm not here. I'm not going to let the event be about debating the terror, all this stuff. So next, and I don't want to discourage. I love the questions, but anything that's like I'm looking to take the conversation away from like the headline news that we always talk about. I think I saw yours first and then over there.
Sure. So you were sort of talking about how once the Mizrahi people following these protests got at least a little bit more access to power, not really power,
Sure, yeah,
like
power. Yeah.
the larger Israeli society as a whole. Has that over the past half century led to any sort of, I guess you call it like interracial relationships or blurring of ethnic lines now that they've gained more access to the society as a whole?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if Mizrahim have been able to access power over the years after the Panthers, has that led to the blurring of identities, the blurring of lines? I think it's hardened lines actually, right? Like before, Mizrahim much more readily mixed with Palestinians when they were held down, and you kind of over time realize that if you can team up with the people above you in the hierarchy, it's more to your benefit than like to team up with the people below you. And that's just like a rational human thing. We see it in the United States. We see it everywhere. Mizrahim have described themselves as a potential bridge to peace with the Palestinians and the wider Middle Eastern world. It's an analogy that has existed for a long, long time. I would point out that Israeli diplomacy, meaning Israeli foreign minister and Israeli ambassadors and Israelis that represent the peace groups and the peace nonprofits and the advocacy organizations, have been dominated by Ashkenazi Jews. So the voice of dialogue or negotiation or whatever with the Palestinians is in these high levels almost always been Ashkenazi. What would have happened if Mizrahim were empowered to like have those conversations? I don't really know, but probably worth trying. I also kind of maybe want to use that question to address this accusation that goes around. If you've been paying attention to, if you've read anything about Mizrahim, and you know, at some point you will encounter the thing that Mizrahim are more right-wing and that they are less interested in peace, and that they are, you know, there's a very popular soccer team that's supported by Mizrahim where their chant is death to Arabs, and it's a terrible, horrible, shameful thing. I just want to pause when we say that, and I want to remember where Mizrahi politics come from, where the self-hatred, where the anti-Arabness comes from. It's really anti-yourself. And that we always need to distinguish between the people who say death to Arabs, which we should not say, and the people who kill Arabs, right? So, I don't want to make a political statement about Israeli actions right now, but historically, who flies the planes, right? That's one of the most elite things you can do with the Israeli military is to fly these fighter jets, and then they end up bombing Beirut or Gaza. Those nowadays that's probably changing, but historically, they've been Ashkenazim. They've been the elite that go to the elite combat units that go fight in Gaza, that go into the intelligence services, that assassinate people, that go into the and become fighter pilots. So again, like whenever someone says that Mizrahim are talk about killing the Arabs, remember there's a difference between talking about it and doing it, and that's again another way that I want you to think more deeply about the things people say. Next question, please. I think I saw you, Norit.
So actually I don't have a question. I just want to...
Wait, so maybe let's give someone an opportunity to give it. We can talk later and someone else will ask a question. Thank you. Yeah, I saw your hand next.
You might have already answered this
All good.
a little bit, but what was the relationship like between the Black Panthers and America?
Great question. What was the relationship between the American Black Panthers and the Israeli Black Panthers? So the American Panthers inspired Panther movements all over the world, right? Aboriginal Panthers in Australia, Dalit Panthers in India, UK had a thing, all over. And bottom line is the American group was way too important to pay attention to like the little cousins in Israel. They were kind of aware, but in aware like, oh, we're so cool, people are copying us all over the place. They did meet up in the early 70s. There was this encounter at like a socialist conference in Europe. But again, like what language would they have spoken? So the exchange was minimal. Funny enough, a lot of people in Israel think that Angela Davis was a Panther, even though she refused to join because they were misogynist. She became the symbol for the Panthers in Israel, where one of the founders actually named his daughter Angela after Angela Davis. Well, they supported the Palestinian movement. That's right. The founder Panther that I kind of centered my book on, he in 2012 had what he considers one of the highlights of his life when he was invited to participate in a symposium, like a lecture series with all these different Panther groups from all over the world in New York. And so there was this moment where they all came together and like, as old people now appeared in kind of solidarity. But there wasn't like a globalized world. Like you couldn't call, like there was, the internet. So everything traveled very slowly. All the information, so not that much of a relationship. All right, in the back, I see you. Good question. So the policies and laws that the government changed in response to the Panthers, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, so yes, these laws that were changed, were they caused directly by the Panthers, or were they part of a larger trend or cultural shift? Which is so a fair question, like, were they actually the cause of these changes that we could observe, right? The government at the time certainly tried to deny that they were the cause. For the very first time Israel spent on social needs and domestic matters was the very year after the Panthers. I'm sorry, more on social needs than on the military was in 1972, the year after the Panthers were founded. And luckily, we have a researcher who in the 90s went and interviewed all the government bureaucrats working inside the ministries that made all the decisions. And they all told him, of course we changed the things because of the Panthers. So we have all that on the record, that the changes were directly caused. And you know, not necessarily because they thought the Panthers were right, but because they wanted to quell the unrest. Do you want to take another shot? Your hand was up earlier. Let's see that. Louder, please.
Yeah, given that the original movement was kind of based around like acceptance and social services and improving those, do you think that the original movement would be pleased with the results today's, given that like there's been progress made in those, or if they'd be disappointed if they not to move forward this?
So the question is, given that the movement was about social service, they were a protest movement, but about inclusion, right? And as we said, would they be happy about the result? So that about the result today. So the anti-Zionist Panther that I sent the book on, certainly not. He thinks that where Israel today is an absolute tragedy, that the Mizrahim have been co-opted into some terrible stuff. And that he doesn't have a lot of hope at age 80 now for the future of the country. And he has a saying now. I'm not going to quote him because I'm going to butcher it. He speaks very poetically. Got a really good saying about this. Other people are just really proud of having participated and reaping the benefits of like less discrimination, like, and glad that their grandkids get to go to college in Israel where they didn't finish third grade. So like most people, they're wrapped up in their own lives, and like they see how their lives played out. Yeah, back there against the wall. Good idea. Yeah. Good idea.
As an American, we look back on our Black Panther Party, it certainly evokes a far range of emotions. And I was wondering, this first Black Panther Party, how does the dominant Israeli narrative
Oh, good question. So the American Black Panthers evoke a range of emotions and reactions today in the United States. What kind of reactions, or how are the Black Panthers remembered? So this is actually something I like to share, and I didn't get a chance to, so thank you. In Israel, you have right-wing politicians who are nostalgic about the Black Panthers. Imagine Republicans being nostalgic about the American Panthers. That's kind of weird. Wouldn't happen, right? The reason that you see that today is because the Mizrahi public largely, but not all, largely voted right-wing over the years, moved to the right. But also, why would they evoke the Panthers who were a left-wing movement? That's because, regardless of the fact that Panthers fought for very revolutionary, or at least very radical and left-wing policies, they were an authentic social movement that really represented the experience of a whole generation of people. And so, just like the actual movement and energy was co-opted, the memory is also being co-opted today by people who truthfully have no business calling themselves Panthers.
Asaf, we have time for one.
One final question. Who's it going to be? No, I mean, now I intimidate people. Just do it. Just ask your question. You can I'll also stay around behind. You can. Yeah. Oh, I thought.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not really sure who asked this, but what I'm aware of, when Israel was created, all the Mizrahim Jews that came out of their countries, rather than like the Ashkenazi Jews telling them.
So you're asking whether it's true what you heard that Mizrahim were kicked out of their countries when Israel was created. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. The answer is very, very complicated and it changes from country to country. But that basic sentence is 100% wrong, right? Because the biggest Mizrah community out of any country was in Morocco. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Morocco, or about 250,000 Jews. Israel was created in 1948. There was still a very large Jewish community in Morocco in the 1960s, right? So they left way after the establishment of Israel. For them, they stayed, and they ended up leaving because of the end of French colonialism and the end of, right, because they benefited from French colonialism, and then they came, actually, a lot of them went to France where there was better stuff.
Morocco. No, Morocco, Canada.
Canada, right, Montreal, Canada, and France, and a lot of them also came to Israel, of course, a very large number. In some places you could say they were certainly kicked out, but I think I talked about this a bit, that what happened was in the 20s, 30s, in the early 20th century, there was this potential to be, you could be Arab of any religion. The Middle East was a very, very diverse place. There were all kinds of ethnic groups, all kinds of religions, and it wasn't a binary Jew and Arab. And then once there was this idea of pan-Arabism, that we're all Arabs and we're all going to fight Western colonialism together and create something else. That gave way to Arab nationalism. Meanwhile, Zionism was on the rise. All these other Jewish movements that could have risen didn't. Zionism, which privileged a very particular way of thinking about Jewishness, emerged. And by 1948, in a lot of places, those created an impossible identity. And Jews either fled, were kicked out, or in many cases just saw this as an opportunity to fulfill a desire that had been handed down to them in Scripture since time immemorial, of a return to Zion, of a religious return, right? So Mizrahim came to Israel as observant Jews. And every family has their own story, every country, right? We're talking like 22 different countries that Mizrahim came from. It's all kind of different. So again, anytime someone tells you these broad things about Mizrahim or about Israel and Palestine, they're probably wrong. Now, you can say, I don't care, I still maintain my politics. Okay, I don't know. You're welcome to do that, but I prefer to know what I'm talking about before I take a stance. No, I mean, we need to take a stance before no, also that'll be another, people tell you don't take a stance because it's too complicated, you don't understand. It's okay, take a stance and learn, right? Fight while you learn. And be smarter as, with your actions.
Thank you all for coming. I want to reiterate what I said. You should buy this book, and you should read this book, and you should share this story with
Or
others.
borrow it from the library, or if you don't want to buy
Yeah,
it.
find a library that has it. Force this library to buy it, and
They haven't yet?
no, not yet. Not yet.
Tell them.
So, thank you very much
Yeah.
for being here. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Water.
Now I need.
Yeah, now you need it.
Um,
You